It's March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March. Julius Caesar, the man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and declared himself dictator for life, walks confidently into the Senate. Little does he know, the very men he trusts are preparing to betray him. The whispers of a conspiracy have been growing louder. But Caesar dismisses the warnings, unaware that the end of his life and his reign is about to unfold in a brutal act of violence. Julius Caesar was a man of immense power, celebrated for his military genius and political brilliance. Yet, his rise to the top made him a target for those who feared his ambitions. Among those plotting his death were some of his closest allies, men he had fought beside and trusted. The conspiracy, led by Brutus and Cassius, would culminate in a shocking act of violence that would forever alter the course of Roman history. Caesar's assassination didn't just mark the end of his life. It revealed the fragility of power, the depths of betrayal, and the brutal consequences of political rivalry. Julius Caesar's rise to power was nothing short of remarkable. Born into a patrician family, he initially struggled for political relevance. But through sheer ambition, military brilliance, and an understanding of Roman politics, he quickly ascended through the ranks. His military conquests, particularly his campaigns in Gaul, cemented his reputation as one of Rome's greatest generals. Caesar's victories brought him fame, wealth, and the loyalty of his troops, making him an unstoppable force. His ability to win over the hearts of the common people with generous public games and land reforms earned him their unwavering support, while the Senate watched with growing concern. His political savvy was unparalleled. As part of the First Triumvirate, a powerful alliance with Pompey and Crassus, Caesar was able to manipulate his way into the highest echelons of power. However, it was his decision to cross the Rubicon in 49 BC, defying the Senate's authority, that marked his most daring move. By marching his army into Italy, he declared open defiance of the Republic and set in motion a civil war that would ultimately see him as the ruler of Rome. Once in power, Caesar implemented a series of sweeping reforms. He enacted laws to relieve debt, redistributed land, and even extended citizenship to people in the provinces. These moves made him popular with the masses, but they also alarmed the Roman elite. The Senate, whose power was waning under Caesar's growing influence, saw him as a direct threat to their authority. The idea of one man holding so much control was unthinkable in the Republic, where power had always been shared among the Senate and the people. As Caesar centralized power and further eroded the Senate's influence, the seeds of dissent were sown. Many feared his growing ambitions, especially when he was appointed dictator for life in 44 BC. These men, once his allies, began to plot his downfall. To them, Caesar wasn't just a ruler, he was a tyrant, and his reign was a direct threat to the ideals of the Republic. The once loyal Brutus, along with other senators, saw in Caesar's rise a future where the Senate would be obsolete and the Roman Republic would be replaced by a dictatorship. These men feared that the Republic, built on a system of checks and balances, would be forever destroyed, and that Caesar's power would mark the end of their own influence. The whispers of dissent grew louder, and the plot against Caesar began to take shape. The conspiracy against Julius Caesar didn't come from the fringes. It came from within his own inner circle. Some of the men who plotted his assassination were once his closest allies, trusted confidants who had risen to power alongside him. The conspiracy was not a single moment of treachery, but a slow, brewing storm of fear, jealousy, and political ideology. Among the most prominent conspirators were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, two men with deep ties to Caesar. Cassius, once a general under Caesar, felt increasingly threatened by the centralization of power and the erosion of his own influence. Brutus, however, presented a more personal conflict. Brutus, a man with both the blood of Caesar and the Senate running through his veins, was Caesar's friend and ally. His mother, Servilia, had been one of Caesar's lovers, and his connection to the dictator was both familial and political. Yet, as Caesar's power grew unchecked, Brutus struggled with a deep internal conflict. On one hand, he owed his rise to Caesar, who had pardoned him after the civil war. Caesar had shown Brutus immense trust, even making him one of his closest advisors. On the other hand, Brutus saw Caesar's actions, his elevation to dictator for life, his disregard for the traditional republican system, as a direct threat to Rome's republican values. Brutus was torn between loyalty to his benefactor and his sense of duty to the republic, which he believed was in peril. The conspirators, led by Cassius and Brutus, felt that Caesar's ambition was slowly transforming Rome into a dictatorship. They believed that if Caesar were allowed to continue consolidating power, the Senate would be nothing more than a rubber stamp, and Rome would be ruled by one man, an emperor in all but name. Their justification for assassination was not just personal envy, but a deep-rooted fear that Caesar's reign would destroy the very fabric of the Republic. For the conspirators, the betrayal was deeply personal. These men were not strangers to Caesar. They were his friends, his confidants, and in many cases, his family. Brutus had sat at Caesar's side for years, advising him in critical decisions, yet he was now part of the group plotting to end his life. Cassius, once loyal to Caesar, had seen his influence slip away as Caesar's power grew, making him resentful of the very man he had once served. To them, this was not a cold political decision. It was an act of desperation, a belief that they were saving Rome from tyranny, even if it meant betraying the man who had given them so much. The personal nature of the conspiracy only deepened the tragedy. These were not faceless assassins, but men who had once fought side by side with Caesar, trusted him, and in some cases, loved him. The plan to kill Caesar would be executed not by outsiders, but by the very people who had shared his victories and tasted his successes. The blood of betrayal ran deep, and the assassination was not just a political act. It was the destruction of friendships, loyalty, and honor. Caesar's murder was not only a blow to his reign, it was a wound to the heart of those who had once walked in his shadow. March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, dawned like any other day for Julius Caesar. Confident and commanding, he entered the Senate, unaware that this would be the last time he would do so. The conspirators had spent weeks preparing for this moment, watching from the shadows as they awaited the perfect opportunity to strike. Caesar, ever the leader, was accustomed to power, surrounded by men who had sworn loyalty to him, who had once fought under his banner. But on this day, those very men would be the ones to betray him. In the hours leading up to his fateful meeting, Caesar received multiple warnings. The most famous of these came from the soothsayer who had earlier predicted that something terrible would happen on the Ides of March. Beware the Ides of March. The soothsayer had warned, but Caesar, dismissing it as superstition, brushed it off with a wave. The Ides of March have come, he later remarked, to which the soothsayer replied, yes, but they are not over. Still, Caesar marched forward, unconcerned by the ominous prediction. The tension was palpable as Caesar entered the Senate house. The conspirators, cloaked in their roles as trusted senators, stood silently in the crowd, awaiting their signal. As Caesar took his seat, he was surrounded by men he trusted implicitly, men who had once been his allies, his friends, his confidants. These men were supposed to protect him, to advise him, but that day, they were the ones plotting his death. The Senate room, once a place of political discussion and governance, was now a stage for the most notorious act of betrayal in Roman history. As Caesar sat before the Senate, the conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, began to move into position. The moment had come. Then, in an instant, the chaos erupted. The first blow came from Casca, the conspirator who struck Caesar in the neck. The shock was immediate. Caesar, stunned by the sudden violence, turned toward his attacker. But as he tried to comprehend what was happening, the blows rained down from all sides. The men who had pledged their loyalty, the men who had once fought alongside him, now turned their daggers on the man who had given them everything. Caesar tried to defend himself, but the assault was too swift, too brutal. The Senate floor became a scene of violent chaos, as each conspirator took their turn, stabbing Caesar in a coordinated attack. As he was stabbed repeatedly, Caesar's once imposing figure was reduced to a crumpled body on the cold Senate floor. The final blow, however, would be the most tragic. Seeing Brutus, his former ally, among the attackers, Caesar is said to have looked up and uttered the words, "E tu, Brute, and you, Brutus." The shock of seeing his most trusted friend turn against him was the final blow to a man who had once believed that no one could challenge his power. The Ides of March had come, and with them, the brutal end of Julius Caesar. The Senate, once a symbol of Roman governance, had become the stage for one of the most tragic and violent betrayals in history. The empire that Caesar had built was now left in chaos, and his death marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. The question of whether Caesar's assassination saved Rome or doomed it would echo throughout history. But one thing was clear. The man who had conquered nations and built empires had been struck down by those he trusted most. The brutality of the assassination was not just in the number of stabs, 23 in total, but in the way it unfolded. Each conspirator seemed to have a personal vendetta, a sense of fear, or a desire for power that led them to strike. Some believed they were saving the Republic from a dictator, while others were driven by jealousy and ambition, hoping to carve out a future for themselves in a post-Caesar world. But the violence of the attack was overwhelming. Caesar, once the most powerful man in Rome, was reduced to a crumpled heap on the floor, his life fading away as his own Senate, his own allies, turned on him. The chaos that followed was equally intense. Senators who had not participated in the conspiracy stood in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Some fled the scene in fear of what would happen next, while others stood frozen, watching as one of Rome's greatest leaders bled to death. In those final moments, Caesar's assassination not only ended his life, it marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. What followed would be years of civil war, power struggles, and the eventual rise of an empire. The assassination of Caesar, driven by fear and ambition, revealed how fragile even the most powerful leaders could be when faced with betrayal. Caesar's death would haunt Rome, echoing through history as a reminder of the cost of absolute power and the treachery that can arise from those closest to you. In the immediate aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, the conspirators, believing they had saved the Roman Republic from a tyrant, were filled with a false sense of triumph. They had hoped to restore the traditional power of the Senate, believing that by eliminating Caesar, they would bring about a new era of republican governance, free from autocratic rule. However, what they failed to foresee was the chaos they would unleash, a chaos that would plunge Rome into civil war and destroy the very republic they sought to preserve. Caesar's death left a massive power vacuum. While the conspirators had struck down the dictator, they had not created a clear path for governance. They underestimated the political savvy of those who remained loyal to Caesar and failed to account for the fierce competition for power that would soon erupt. The Senate, now in disarray, was unable to hold Rome together. What followed was a battle for control of the empire, with former allies of Caesar, Mark Antony, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Lepidus, rushing to fill the void left by Caesar's death. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, sought to consolidate his power, using his position as consul to gather support from Caesar's loyal legions and the people. Octavian, Caesar's young adoptive son, returned to Rome from exile and quickly positioned himself as the rightful heir to his father's legacy, leveraging his familial connection and Caesar's popularity among the masses. Lepidus, a former general, an ally of Caesar, sought to claim his share of the power. The three men formed the Second Triumvirate, a political alliance aimed at consolidating control over Rome. But this alliance was anything but stable. Ambitions ran high, and allegiances shifted rapidly, leading to violent clashes and betrayals. The ensuing struggle for dominance was fierce. Mark Antony, with his loyal military forces, fought to maintain his influence in the east, while Octavian's supporters in the west rallied around his cause. Meanwhile, Lepidus was slowly pushed aside as Antony and Octavian began to vie for supreme control of Rome. The infighting reached a peak at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's forces decisively defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The victory left Octavian as the undisputed ruler of Rome, marking the end of the Republic and the dawn of the Roman Empire. Rather than restoring the Republic, the conspirators had set the stage for a more centralized autocracy. Caesar's assassination had not ended the concentration of power in the hands of one man. It had only paved the way for a new leader to rise. Octavian's victory at Actium sealed the fate of Rome, as he would go on to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. With his rise to power, the Roman Republic was no more, replaced by an empire that would last for centuries. The conspiracy that sought to preserve the ideals of the Republic had not only failed in its goal, it had inadvertently ensured the very autocracy it had feared. The assassination of Caesar did not restore Rome to its former republican glory. Instead, it led to the rise of an emperor whose rule would be far more absolute than Caesar's ever was. The fall of the Roman Republic, once an emblem of shared power and governance, was sealed by the actions of those who believed they were saving it. Instead of a restoration, they had created an empire. The irony of Caesar's assassination lies in the fact that the very act meant to protect the Republic and its traditions of shared power actually destroyed them. By killing Caesar, the conspirators inadvertently cleared the path for a ruler whose authority would be unquestioned. Augustus, formerly known as Octavian, would become the first emperor of Rome, securing total control and marking the end of the Roman Republic. Though he carefully crafted the appearance of a restored republic, the truth was clear: the power Caesar had amassed was now held by Augustus alone, and the Republic's ideals were officially dead. The political landscape of Rome shifted permanently. Caesar had shown that a single man could wield absolute power, and that the Roman people would support a ruler who could provide security, prosperity, and stability. Augustus, inheriting this legacy, built the framework of imperial rule, centralizing authority in a way Caesar never had. The Senate became little more than a ceremonial body, powerless to challenge the emperor's decrees. The idea of a ruler holding unchecked power, once unimaginable in a republic based on shared authority, became a normalized reality, extending far beyond the reign of Augustus and into the centuries of the Roman Empire. In the long run, Caesar's assassination, rather than preventing the rise of tyranny, accelerated the very autocracy the conspirators feared. The death of a man who sought power above all else, who had centralized control, resulted in an even more centralized power in the form of Augustus. The irony lies in how the conspirators, by seeking to preserve the Republic, set in motion the birth of an empire. Their actions led to a political shift that would shape the fate of Rome for the next several hundred years and solidified the idea that absolute power could no longer be questioned. Caesar's death did not restore the ideals of the Republic. It ultimately made the concept of a single ruler, with control over all aspects of Roman life, an inescapable reality. Julius Caesar's assassination didn't just end a life, it ended an era. The brutal betrayal of one of Rome's greatest leaders set in motion the fall of the Republic and the rise of an empire. showing us how easily power can slip from the hands of the few into the hands of one. History is dark, and we must remember it.